Very Machiavellian music from TK Turbo, the producer there, as we come off the break. It's Big Talker. BigTalker.Live, if you want to follow us on live. The Big Talker app is an excellent tool. You can even just say Big Talker to your smart speaker. It'll bring it right up. We're on Facebook Live today, along with the live streams. The app's great. You can actually pick between video and audio. So it's really smart, puts those things together. I'm Andrew Donaldson, filling in on the morning shift this morning. TK Turbo producing, and we're thrilled to be joined by yet another of our great Young Voices contributor. Somebody said one time, they said, every time you introduce Young Voices contributors, you always say great. I was like, because they're all great. I get to work with a lot of them, especially now that I'm doing the mentoring side of it. Here's another one, Amanda Griffiths joining us. How are you, ma'am?
I'm well. How about yourself, Andrew?
Thrilled to be talking to you. Glad you're here.
Wonderful to be here.
We were joking. The Machiavelli was a little inside joke. She deals with Machiavellian political thought. She received her MA from the University of Chicago. I guess if you got to go to school in the Midwest. Has done some work with Cato and some other things. She's a PhD student now. You got to have a lot of those letters after your name, my friend.
Yeah, I really don't know why. I guess I'm just collecting them at this point. I don't know, trying to avoid life a little bit. Maybe, I'm not sure.
I hear you. I'm a community college dropout, so it's all good.
There you go. Cheers.
I went back later, but I had to grow up a little bit first. You were writing about something that strikes home. Our Big Talker originates out of Wilmington, North Carolina. Wilmington is a port city. You can drive right over the bridge and you see the container ships coming in and out. You've been writing about tariffs, and you've been writing about China. And you wrote one of the best headlines I've seen in a while, and I do this for a living. Biden inches towards the right move on tariffs for all the wrong reasons. Excellent job there. This confuses people because people inherently, it's my feeling, you tell me what you think. People inherently understand that China especially is an adversary, especially economically, also geopolitically, but they get economically that this is an adversarial relationship, right? But they also understand, they like cheap stuff at Walmart, so they understand it's a necessary relationship. Before we get into specifics with things like tariffs and trade and all that, we kind of need to just start there, because this is really where we're at, where it's like a push-pull thing, right?
Exactly, yeah. So in terms of our relationship right now with China, it's incredibly complex, it's incredibly intricate, and there's a lot of codependency, I would say. So what happened is that during the Trump administration, I won't get too in the weeds on the tariffs, but there were a bunch of tariffs that were levied against China in response to this trade war that Trump had with China. And there were several tariffs across the board, but there were different tranches of tariffs. So some of those tariffs affected consumer goods on the consumer side, things like bicycles, things that are imports. Other things affected more technological tariffs and products. So in response, well, not really in response, but over the course of time, China has been doing a whole bunch of things that are problematic, not just as far as the U.S. is concerned, but as far as the world is concerned. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, exploiting its status, self-declared status as a developing country with the World Trade Organization, which once again, you can self-declare as a developing country. Parameters are pretty low for all that. So what we have is that the U.S. will do one thing, the CCP will respond, and it seems like tariffs are one of the least effective strategies that the U.S. has. In the article, I say it's more of a flex than an actual squeeze as far as really any country is concerned, but especially the CCP.
Let's start with some nomenclature, though, because we want to make sure everybody's on the same page here, because tariffs has become buzzwordy. Tariffs has become, something you stick on your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed to get people upset. Define it for us, though. Explain this to me like I'm 5 so that I can keep up with you here. What is a tariff actually? Because I think people are blowing past that one part of this sometimes, and we don't get into the nomenclature of what it actually is. Because some people seem to think it's like a fine, like you're fining somebody. Other people seem to think it's like a tax on somebody. Just define tariffs so everybody's on the same song sheet here.
A tariff, simply put, is something that makes a product more expensive if it is from another country. So it's placed on a particular good, or usually a category of goods that comes from another country. Typically, that's in the interest of putatively making the home country that's levying the tariffs more competitive, maybe a more competitive place to buy the goods instead. So basically, it means if this thing comes from another country, then it's going to cost more money.
And money is kind of the key to all this, because when you're talking economics and trade, you're just talking about transfer of goods and money. Like on the real basic level, that's all we're talking about. The thing with China, but the part with China is now you got to transport, and we all got a real world lesson in supply chain the last 2.5 years, haven't we? So there's that part of it. But then where the tariffs come in is how much our goods are going to cost versus what their goods are going to cost, and vice versa. And that's where this starts getting adversarial in a hurry, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And again, the reason that we initially had these tariffs were for a couple of reasons, right? So there was this idea that we had a trade deficit with China. You remember hearing Trump talk about this a lot, that basically China is getting more out of our trade relations than the U.S. is. Another reason that we imposed tariffs, again, ostensibly speaking, was because China was misbehaving on the global market, stealing intellectual property. And so it was meant to be a type of consequence for bad or nefarious trade and economic practices.
Right. Okay. So that's the economic side of this. Let's talk political for a second. President Biden has not really changed it much in the tariff realm with China. He's talked about it. Some of his advisors really want to do something about it, but he hasn't actually done anything about it. If this is such a bad policy, why hasn't he done anything about it over the last 2 years? I know the answer is politics, but just to tee it up for you, if it's that bad and he wants to change it and he hasn't, that leans back to a political answer more than an economic or a policy one, right?
That is correct. A lot of the reason that Biden is hedging on tariffs has to do with union pressure. Many of these tariffs that have been imposed against China and just across the world, a bunch of countries, have to do with steel and have to do with other manufacturing goods. There's a strong union influence that's keeping those tariffs in place. And so, in fact, just recently, in fact, it was this past week, you had the Biden administration still dithering on the tariff issue with China, but ironically, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative just defended these same Section 301 tariffs to the Court of International Trade earlier. And this is partly because, again, you've got all of this union pressure, making it very, very unpalatable politically in terms of constituencies for Biden to remove tariffs.
Now, as you sat down to write about this, it's a great piece in International Policy Digest. Biden inches towards the right move on tariffs for the wrong reason. When you sat down to look at this, what was the most important piece, do you think, in understanding why the Biden administration is in the place they are in? I understand they inherited the problem. I understand they inherited the policy. What's the one piece that you think explains this 2 years of kind of waffling, might be a little harsh, but basically just inertia of just letting it go as it is?
Honestly, I think that you have so many interest groups that make removing the tariffs politically unpalatable, not just from the left, we talked about the unions, but also from the right. You have this faction of people who believe that tariffs are sincerely this great squeeze that are going to be this panacea. At the same time, there is inflationary pressure here at home. This is really a desire to balance optics. First, the bad optics of inflation, thinking maybe if we lift some of these tariffs, it'll alleviate inflation. Talk about why that's not really going to be effective. But also the bad optics of removing the tariffs on both the right and the left. You've got people who think that it's going to give China some permission the CCP some permission to keep doing what it's essentially always been doing. So really what this has to do with, this is a problem of not having competitive business practices here at home and using our relationship with the CCP as sort of a scapegoat or a reason to not amend our manufacturing and regulatory policies here.
You used a very specific term. Amanda Griffiths joining us, Young Voices contributor. She's writing in International Policy Digest about tariffs, trade, and China. You used a pretty specific term here. It comes off a little harsh, but I think it's called for. You said that tariffs are a pet virtue signaling device for many politicians, and the ones against China have done very little to quell the CCP's myriad abuses of global trade, not to mention the abuses of their own people and other people's, for that matter, American intellectual property, and private consumer data. This is where something that's virtue signaling in the policy world really has a lot of real world implications, though, isn't it? This is not harmless virtue signaling. This is doing damage.
That's correct. The job of tariffs is to make something more expensive. So if we're just going to virtue signal and make things more expensive, not just for we think possibly manufacturing in China, although we're not exactly doing that, but we're going to make things more expensive here at home, we are neglecting to take actual measures that might help to address what the CCP is doing around the world as it continues to exploit its status as a developing country, as it continues to leach consumer data, private consumer data from users of TikTok. We just had that bombshell report from BuzzFeed, right? As it continues to steal intellectual property, there are real reports, there are real problems, and we are looking the other way in the interest of imposing these tariffs that are, again, only making things more expensive here at home.
Let's talk about that because you raised it in your piece. 80 internal meetings at TikTok revealed what China was doing. Let's be grown folk adults here, first of all. The first thing you got to remember with social media is if you're not paying for a product, you are the product. So some of this is, you click the box, you agreed to it, you put your quarter in the jukebox, this is the song that plays. Some of that's, you have your own agency. However, on top of that, when you're dealing with something like China and the CCP's ability to control basically every facet of business in China, you just know doing business with China. We've got decades of evidence here. There's going to be some malfeasance and they're going to fiddle with things. When it came to TikTok, because everybody just loves their fun little videos, though, this is something very, very different than just Facebook can't get the algorithm right or YouTube took down a page because the automatic algorithm grabbed a word out of context. This is a lot more purposefully and planned than some of those issues, isn't it?
That's correct. So there were over 80 internal meetings at TikTok, and these revealed that ByteDance, which is TikTok's parent company, located in, they have China-based employees, have repeatedly accessed private data about U.S. TikTok users. And the reason that's such a problem is because the CCP is very intertwined with Chinese tech companies. If employees in China have a backdoor to Americans' non-public data, so does the CCP, and that is a big problem.
What's the cure for that? Because this really does, this kind of goes to broader trade with China, really, but we'll just start with the TikTok thing. Is there anything we can really do about it? Because the consumer demand, this isn't going away. It's way too popular. People aren't going to stop putting their private data into this thing. Practically speaking, is there really anything that's going to be able to be done about it?
Well, there are a number of things that can happen on the U.S. side of things with TikTok, and that the company is trying to do or says that they're trying to do to make sure that U.S. user data are stored here. This is one of those situations where if I had my druthers, you'd have another alternative to TikTok that would come up from Silicon Valley. And I think that that's honestly the best way forward and probably the way that we're going to go based on the history of the evolution of tech corporations and the evolution of tech platforms. This comes down, first of all, to user responsibility. It comes down to business responsibility. And yes, I do think generally it needs to be unpalatable for businesses to be dealing with these sorts of relationships with the CCP. But again, tariffs are really kind of a look the other way, a lot of hand waving. This needs to be addressed here at home. This needs to be addressed with our own cyber infrastructure. And fortunately, when there is enough sight, when there is enough consumer sight on corporations, as there is in a liberal market system, then what we can do is consumers can put that pressure on the American side of TikTok, as they're beginning to do, to change some of this.
All right, Amanda Griffiths joining us, Young Voices contributor. Let's get to the buzzword of the day. Everybody's concerned about inflation. You addressed it in your piece as well. What's the relationship there? Because anything policy and economic wise, even trade right now, is going to be geared towards inflation and cost of living crisis that a lot of people are feeling. What's the relationship there? Because usually something like tariffs, there's a bit of a lag there because it takes time for those things to bite. Takes time for the companies to kind of adjust to such things, takes time for the foreign power that the tariffs levied against to adjust. What is its effect on inflation today? What is that lag time? Explain that relationship a little bit for folks.
So just to come right out and say it, there would be almost no effect on inflation if the tariffs that Biden and the Biden administration are considering removing would be removed. This is about $10 billion worth of a more than $300 billion tariff package that the Trump administration levied against Chinese imports. And these affect goods at the consumer point. Basically, they're supposed to affect consumer items like bicycles, things like that. They're not affecting manufacturing goods. They're not affecting things that are going to be used to build things here in America. So they're really supposed to affect sticker prices. The problem is, first of all, these tariffs aren't going to do a lick when it comes to things like food and lodging and transportation, fuel, which is what's really driving inflation. And they're not going to affect manufacturing. I'm also not sure how many people are in the market for things like bicycles right now. These are kind of like luxury gift items that we're talking about. So this is one of the least effective tranches of tariffs that you could possibly be lifting right now. Not that it's a bad thing to lift them. I think that we should, but this is the wrong reason to do it. We wouldn't see an impact on inflation. And just about every economic expert, including Janet Yellen, has said, look, this is not going to be a panacea. So unfortunately, it's really not going to do much of anything if it happens at all. This is a little minute slice off the top of this huge tariff package, and it's not even the one that's most concerning as far as contributions to inflation are concerned.
You use a real world example, Amanda Griffiths joining us from Young Voices, of something that would bite, and it not only would bite long-term strategy-wise, which America kind of sucks at and China's really, really good at. Long-term strategy-wise, this would cross a lot of streams and make a lot of people across the spectrum happy. You talk about the rare earth metal industry, and the reason that is so important is because when you're pushing towards things like climate things, greener things, battery-powered electric vehicles, all that stuff needs rare earth minerals for the batteries. And China basically has a stranglehold on that market. You bring up that is something we talk about, everything from cell phones to Teslas to everything else. The West is just kind of, this is quoting you, the West has effectively handed the CCP through overregulation a monopoly on all this stuff. There's something where it would bite and you could get in there and you could also cross off the being tough on China political box, but it would actually have an effect on things. And it'd be good for the future strategy too.
Absolutely. You summarized that perfectly. So up until 1980, about 99% of the world's heavy rare earth metals were produced from U.S. mining operation. What are rare earth metals? They are in everything. They're in the batteries that power our world, our electric vehicles, our green tech. So it's incredibly important, especially as the Biden administration is queuing up for this green policy, right? And that statistic, that 99%, has completely flipped since then. So today, CCP-backed enterprises produce upwards of 99% of all new rare earth metals. That includes those that are produced in the U.S.'s weapon systems, and that includes those that are produced in our green tech. You know, those electric vehicles that sometimes the very, very far left politicians talk about mandating. Those require rare earth metals that are those have batteries that require rare earth metals that are sourced in China. So that's definitely a problem. The reason that happened is because in 1980, this is a little bit in the weeds, but it's kind of important to understand the intricacies, what needs to happen to change some of this. In 1980, the International Atomic Energy Agency changed the definition of what constitutes source material for nuclear weapons, and basically heavy rare earth byproducts got lumped in. What that meant is that it became incredibly costly to get licensed to extract rare earth metals. So even though we have the capacity to do this mining here, there's just so much overhead, there's just so much regulatory risk that we don't do it. And this happens across the West, but particularly in the US, which used to produce 99% of rare earths. So this is something that we could easily change. It requires taking out those old regulatory books and dusting them off, but it requires saying, look, you've got a country that's run by the Chinese Communist Party that has incredibly environmentally toxic methods of sourcing. And you have the things that we could do here, where we could be a huge global competitor in the rare earth space. And we just handed the CCP this industry because we have all these companies here that are too afraid to innovate because we're tying their hands. This requires fixing regulations, but that would be huge in terms of our competitive advantage against the CCP.
Yeah, Amanda Griffiths. Let's wrap this up this way. People talk about, can free trade be an effective tool against authoritative regimes? You just touched on it yourself. We know in the Cold War, we basically beat, we won the Cold War more economically than any other way, and then culturally at the end as the culture impacted them. China's a different beast, though. You're talking about a workforce that's 700 million people that are basically just slightly above slave labor because the CCP has complete control over their lives. You're talking about a huge chunk of the world economy. You're talking about the number one, maybe be getting surpassed by India next year, depending on estimates, but the number one or number two population country on the planet. This is a little bit different beast. Is free trade and fair trade still going to be effective tools against the totalitarian regime of China's ruling party? Because we know the human rights violations and we know we have to deal with the bad actors of the world, but we should still be able to put some pressure on them. Is the free trade and is economic way going to be a way for us to do that?
Absolutely, but part of it begins with actually making free trade free trade. And it begins with saying, look, if you're part of the World Trade Organization, you play by the World Trade Organization's rules. You don't hand out these sweetheart subsidies to industries like you're allowed to, or like you claim you're allowed to do because you say that you're a developing country. You don't do any of that. We need to enforce the rules that we have on the books. And really, the precise reason that tariffs are ineffective in totalitarian regimes is because totalitarian regimes, as you mentioned, don't rely on the overall economic prosperity and success of their people. So this is precisely why things like tariffs are not going to be effective. But we do need to take a hard hand against the things that the CCP is doing and stop distracting ourselves with things like tariffs. Yes, an open market is critical to doing that, but that means playing by our own rules, not the CCP's, and saying, hey, we have a playing field and we've got to respect the rules that we have laid down to make sure that we are competing freely and fairly. And that means both here in America and on the global stage.
Yeah, Amanda Griffiths joining us. I would be remiss if I didn't end this. This has been a heavy topic. Let's have a little fun for a second, though. I've got to ask you, because you are now a bona fide expert on it because it's in your bio. There's so much myth and legend surrounding it. Give us a real good Machiavelli story. Give us something juicy that people may not know. I know they hear all the legends, all the, give us something good about Machiavelli to kind of end this on a fun note.
Well, he had a long-standing, what seems like a genuine love affair with an actress named Barbera Fiorentina. And all of his plays, his famous plays, always include parts for her. And they also usually include a lusty old man, which is kind of Machiavelli making fun of himself, being lusty for this young actress. So I think one of my favorite Machiavelli stories has to do with his love affair with Barbera Fiorentina. as well as his protectiveness of her, where he would sort of share her with his friends, but would repeatedly write to his friends only if she's cool with it, basically. So that's probably one of my favorite Machiavelli stories and tidbits.
Fantastic. Love it. We will continue to talk to you. You're a great resource. Amanda Griffiths joining us. Let folks know where they can follow you and what you have going on until we get a chance to talk to you again, my friend.
Sure. Well, it's been a blast, first of all, Andrew. And they can follow me. People can follow me on Twitter at Ajax the Griff. So AJAXTHEGRIFF. And that's on thetwitter.com. You can find me there.
Fantastic stuff. Really appreciate your time today. We'll be talking again. I'm going to have you over on Hertel soon. I'll get with you on that. Great job. Everybody go read the piece, International Policy Digest. Biden does the right thing for the wrong reason. That's kind of a theme of this presidency, but we'll talk again later. Amanda Griffiths, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Have a great one.
Appreciate it. Great job.